Alright, so each week I'll be posting some introductory videos just to introduce you to the readings, just to give you a little brief background. So for this week to start, we're going to be looking at Plato's Apology. So we have the dialogues from Plato. So Plato was a student of Socrates, and Socrates himself never wrote anything down. So everything that we have from Socrates comes from Plato and other people who followed Plato. So a little information about Socrates. So Socrates was born in 470 BC. He died in 399 BC, which, spoiler alert, we're going to see at the end of this dialogue. And Socrates, to a certain extent, is the first really famous philosopher. There are philosophers sort of prior to Socrates. There are people like Thales and Pythagoras and important philosophers like that. But Socrates sort of forms an important point in the history of philosophy, to the point to where all the people prior to Socrates get called pre-Socratic philosophers. And the philosophy, in the sense that we're talking about it in this class, really starts with Socrates, and the project that he creates, and that Plato, his student, carries out, and that Aristotle, Plato's student, continues to carry out. Now, Socrates spent most of his time sort of in the streets of Athens, living there in ancient Greece, questioning people about things they knew. He had a desperate need to want to know what virtue is, what courage is, what justice is. So if anyone around him in the market sort of said something that made it sound like they knew what justice was, Socrates would jump on it and sort of begin to question them. Oh, well, you must know what justice is. Tell me, please, what is it? And many of the dialogues that we'll read about Socrates have that sort of form, where he runs across someone in an everyday circumstance and starts questioning them about some higher good or something that he wants to have knowledge about. But his constant questioning of the adults attracted students from the youth, because oftentimes the adults he questioned were oftentimes sort of the elites in the city who had a lot of stature, didn't have good answers for Socrates. And Socrates would often show them that their answers were bad. And so a lot of students, like Socrates, who were kids at this point, thought Socrates was kind of cool, because he was sort of thumbing his nose at the older generation. So he sort of formed a clique of students, of which Plato was one of those. So in the actual apology that we're going to be reading, we're going to find Socrates near the end of his life at a trial. So he's been brought to trial by three people, by Antaeus, Meletus, and Lycon. And they've sort of grown tired of Socrates' constant questioning. They're part of this upper echelon in the city of Athens, and they're sort of ready to shut Socrates up. And to a certain extent, what they expected from this trial is sort of bring him to trial, show him that he's not welcome here, but, just like let him leave. Show him that no one really wants him here to Athens, but they didn't really want to hurt him ultimately. They just wanted to get him out of the city, and they thought this was the best way to do it. But Socrates, as we'll see, sort of refuses to stop doing what he's doing and refuses to leave the city. And so they feel like they've been backed into a corner to where ultimately at the end they're going to end up killing him. So in the first part of the dialogue, Socrates is going to be offering his apology in the court. And apology here we don't mean, and you'll notice very quickly as he's reading through it, in no way is Socrates actually apologizing in the sense that we normally think of it. He's not saying I'm sorry. He's not regretting what he's done in his life. This apology comes from the Greek word apologia, which just is a legal word for the legal defense. So he's basically giving his opening defense statement. So after his defense statement, we don't have the prosecution statement, but basically the huge assembly, which is made up of hundreds of people there from the city of Athens, they all vote on whether he's found guilty or not guilty. And we'll see that at 35e, that assembly departs, they go to vote, and they come back and they find him guilty. And Socrates even mentions that it's a fairly narrow margin they find him guilty by. But then after finding him guilty, to figure out the sentence, so whereas here there's typically certain sort of standards about the sentence, or a judge will proclaim the sentence, what they did in ancient Greece is the prosecution and the defense would both propose a penalty, propose a sentence, and then the jury of the hundreds of people, they would vote on which of those to apply. And it's generally a fairly good idea to do something like that, because people mellow out and sort of get somewhere in the middle, and you end up coming to like a fairly compromised sort of sentence somewhere in the middle of where, and typically you end up at a good spot. But as we see, sort of the prosecution calls for execution, and Socrates is a little more coy. So when you read it, you'll see what he thinks his punishment ought to be. That's what he does in that second section. And then the jury is going to vote on what they think the sentence will be, and then Socrates has a few sort of final remarks. So as you're reading, a few things to look for that we're going to be talking about this week and through the rest of the semester, because all philosophy sort of follows on from Socrates, is one, look at Socrates' defense of the philosophical life. He thinks that he's living sort of the best way to live. So look at what he means by the philosophical life and why he thinks this is the right thing to do. Second, look at Socrates' use of questioning. He's actually going to pull Meletus up at one point and sort of through a series of questions try to prove his own innocence. He's going to try and prove that he hasn't committed the crimes they think he has, almost just through a deductive argument. So it's pretty fascinating. And finally, we're going to examine what gets called sometimes the Socratic paradox. Socrates is going to say something like, "I know that I know nothing," which is a peculiar statement, because if you know that you know nothing, you obviously know one thing, namely you know nothing. But now that's not true that you know nothing, because you do know something. So we'll examine sort of that and see what Socrates might mean when he makes a statement like that. So look at those things. After you've answered the questions, a video will get posted giving a more in-depth explanation of the Apology, answering the questions from your reading questions after you turn them in. So if you have any questions about it, please email me.